Book 4, Invasions of Germany and Britain, Part 1, Massacre of the Usipetes and Tenctheri, 55 BC. 1. In the following winter, in which the consulship of Pompey and Crassus began, the German tribes of the Usipetes and the Tenctheri crossed the Rhine in large numbers not far from its mouth. They were forced to migrate because for several years they had been subjected to harassing attacks by the Suebi and prevented from tilling their land. The Suebi are by far the largest and most warlike of the German nations. It is said that they have 100 cantons, each of which provides annually 1,000 armed men for service in foreign wars. Those who are left at home have to support the men in the army as well as themselves, and the next year take their turn of service while the others stay at home. Thus, both agriculture and military instruction and training continue without interruption. No land, however, is the property of private individuals, and no one is allowed to cultivate the same plot for more than 1 year. They do not eat much cereal food, but live chiefly on milk and meat, and spend much time in hunting. Their diet, daily exercise, and the freedom from restraint that they enjoy, for from childhood they do not know what compulsion or discipline is, and do nothing against their inclination, combine to make them strong and as tall as giants. They inure themselves, in spite of the very cold climate in which they live, to wear no clothing but skins, and these so scanty that a large part of the body is uncovered, and to bathe in the rivers. 2. Traders are admitted into their country more because they want to sell their booty than because they stand in any need of imports. Even horses, which the Gauls are inordinately fond of and purchase at big prices, are not imported by the Germans. They are content with their homebred horses, which, although undersized and ugly, are rendered capable of very hard work by daily exercise. In cavalry battles they often dismount and fight on foot, training the horses to stand perfectly still so that they can quickly get back to them in case of need. In their eyes it is the height of effeminacy and shame to use a saddle, and they do not hesitate to engage the largest force of cavalry riding saddled horses, however small their own numbers may be. They absolutely forbid the importation of wine because they think that it makes men soft and incapable of enduring hard toil. 3. They regard it as the proudest glory of a nation to keep the largest possible area around its frontiers uninhabited, because it shows that many other people are inferior to it in military might. It is said, for example, that on one side of the Suebic territory the country is uninhabited for a distance of more than 550 miles. On the other side, their nearest neighbours are the Ubii, who were once, by German standards, a considerable and prosperous nation. They are somewhat more civilized than the rest of the Germans, for living on the Rhine, close to the frontier of Gaul, where traders visit them regularly, they have adopted Gallic customs. The Suebi, after repeated attempts to oust them from their home by force of arms, found them too numerous and strong to be dispossessed, but compelled them to pay tribute and greatly reduced their pride and power. 4. The Usipetes and Tenctheri were in the same case. For many years they withstood the Suebi's pressure, but eventually were driven from their country, and after wandering for 3 years in many parts of Germany reached the Rhine in the territory of the Menapii, who had lands, farmhouses, and villages on both banks of the river. Terrified by the arrival of such a multitude, the Menapii abandoned their dwellings on the German bank and placed outposts on the Gallic bank to prevent the emigrants from crossing. The Germans tried every expedient, but not having boats with which to force a passage, and being unable to cross by stealth because of the Menapian pickets, they pretended to return to their home country, and marched in that direction for 3 days. Then they turned back again, and, recovering the whole distance in a single night, their cavalry made a surprise attack on the unsuspecting Menapii, who, on being informed by their patrols of their enemy's departure, had fearlessly recrossed the Rhine and returned to their villages. The Germans slaughtered them, seized their boats, crossed the river before the Menapii on the Gallic side knew what was afoot, took possession of all their farmhouses, and lived on their provisions for the rest of the winter. 5. These events were reported to Caesar. The unstable character of the Gauls made him anxious, for they are easily induced to form new plans and generally welcome political change, and he thought it better to place no reliance on them. It is a custom of theirs to stop travellers, even against their will, and to question them about what they have heard by chance or by inquiry on this or that subject. And in the towns a crowd will gather round traders and demand to know what country they have come from and what they have learnt there. Such hearsay reports often induce them to make momentous decisions, which they are bound to repent immediately afterwards, since they credulously swallow unconfirmed rumours, and most of their informants invent such answers as they think will please them. 6. Caesar was aware of this habit and, not wishing to find himself faced with a dangerous war, set out to rejoin his army earlier in the season than usual. On his arrival, he found that his suspicions were correct. A number of tribes had sent embassies to the Usipetes and Tenctheri, inviting them to go farther afield than the Rhineland and promising to supply all their requirements. This attractive prospect had induced the Germans to range over a wider area, and they had now reached the country of the Eburones and the Condrusi, dependents of the Treveri. Caesar thought it advisable to say nothing to the Gauls about the information he had received. Summoning their leaders, therefore, he addressed them in soothing and reassuring terms, and told them to furnish cavalry for the campaign which he proposed to conduct against the Germans. 7. After arranging his corn supply and making his selection of the cavalry, he marched towards the district where the invading Germans were said to be. He was a few days' march away when envoys arrived from them with the following message: "We Germans are not taking aggressive action against the Roman people, but we are ready to fight if provoked, for it is our custom to resist any attacker and to ask no quarter. We wish to say, however, that we have come into Gaul not from choice, but because we were expelled from our homes. If you Romans desire our friendship, we can be of service to you. Either grant us land to live in, or let us keep what we have won by the sword. The only people whose superiority we acknowledge are the Suebi, with whom the gods themselves cannot compete. There is no one else on earth that we cannot conquer." 8. Caesar made what he considered a suitable reply to this oration, but the upshot of his remarks was that there could be no friendship between him and the Germans if they remained in Gaul. He said that it was not reasonable for men who had been unable to protect their own territory to expect to occupy other people's. There was no land available in Gaul which he could justly assign to them, particularly in view of their large numbers, but they might settle if they chose in the country of the Ubii, whose ambassadors were then with him, complaining of the wrongs done to them by the Suebi and asking for assistance. He would order the Ubii to admit them. 9. The German envoy said they would refer Caesar's reply to their countrymen for consideration, and return in 3 days. In the meantime they asked him not to move his camp any nearer, but Caesar refused this request also. He knew that a large detachment of their cavalry had been sent across the Meuse some days before to the country of the Ambivaritae in search of corn and plunder, and he thought that they must be expecting these back, and that this was their reason for trying to gain time. 10. The Meuse rises in the Vosges mountains in the country of the Lingones. It is joined by a tributary from the Rhine called the Waal, making the island of the Batavians, and flows into the Rhine some 75 miles from the sea. The Rhine rises in the country of the Lepontii in the Alps, and flows swiftly for a long distance through the lands of the Helvetii, Sequani, Tribotii, Nemetes, Mediomatrici, and Treveri. As it nears the sea, it divides into several channels, forming a number of very large islands, many of them inhabited by wild barbarian tribes, some of whom are supposed to live on fish and birds' eggs, and discharges itself by several mouths into the North Sea. 11. When Caesar was not more than 12 miles from the Germans, their envoys returned according to agreement, and, meeting him on the march, earnestly begged him to advance no farther. On Caesar's refusing to comply, they asked him to send word to the cavalry which had gone in advance of the column, forbidding them to engage in battle, and also requested leave to send an embassy to the Ubii. They said that if the Ubian chiefs and council would swear to keep faith with them, they would avail themselves of the offer that Caesar had made, and asked for 3 days to complete the necessary negotiations. Caesar believed that all these suggestions had the same object as their previous maneuver, to obtain a further 3 days' delay to give time for the return of the German cavalry from their foray. However, he said that he would restrict his advance that day to 4 miles, the distance that was necessary to get water. On the next day, if as many of them as possible would assemble at his halting place, he would give their requests a formal hearing. In the meantime, he sent orders to the officers who had gone on in front with the whole cavalry force that they were not to attack the enemy and, if attacked themselves, were to remain on the defensive until he approached with the main army. 12. But when the enemy caught sight of our cavalry, 5,000 strong, although they themselves had not 800 horse, those who had crossed the Meuse to get corn having not yet returned, they immediately charged. Our men, who thought themselves safe from attack because the enemy's envoys had only just left Caesar and had asked for a truce for that day, were at first thrown into disorder. When they rallied, the German horsemen, following their usual practice, jumped down, unhorsed a number of our men by stabbing their horses in the belly, put the rest to flight, and kept them on the run in such a panic that they did not stop until they came in sight of the marching column of infantry. In this engagement, 74 of our cavalrymen were killed, including Piso, a gallant Aquitanian of very good family, whose grandfather had been king of his tribe and had been granted the title of friend by the Roman Senate. He went to the assistance of his brother, who was cut off by some of the Germans, and succeeded in rescuing him, but his own horse was wounded and threw him. As long as he could, he resisted with the utmost bravery, but eventually was surrounded and fell covered with wounds. When his brother, who by this time had got well away from the fight, saw what had happened, he galloped straight up to the enemy and let them kill him too. 13. After this treacherous and unprovoked attack by an enemy who had asked for peace, Caesar dismissed all further thought of giving audience to their envoys or accepting any overtures. At the same time, he thought it would be sheer madness to wait till they were reinforced by the return of their cavalry. The Gauls were so scatterbrained that even this single German success had no doubt made a great impression upon them, and they must not be given time to concert plans. He told his generals and quaestor of his decision, and, not wanting to lose a single day in bringing the enemy to battle, marched forward. The next morning he had a great stroke of luck. Still pursuing their policy of treachery and deceit, a large deputation of Germans, comprising all their leaders and elder men of note, came to visit him in his camp. Their ostensible object was to apologize for attacking the day before in contravention of the agreement that they themselves asked for, but they also hoped to hoodwink Caesar into granting an extension of the truce. Caesar was delighted that they had put themselves in his power and ordered them to be detained, while he himself marched his whole army out of camp, with the cavalry bringing up the rear because he thought it had been demoralized by its recent defeat. 14. With the soldiers formed in 3 parallel columns, ready for wheeling into the line of battle, he made a rapid march of 8 miles and reached the enemy's camp before they realized his intention. The speed of his advance and the absence of their leaders combined to throw them into a sudden panic. They had no time to think what to do or to arm themselves, and were too distracted to decide whether it was best to march out against Caesar, to stay and defend the camp, or to flee for their lives. The Roman soldiers could tell that they were afraid by their cries and hurried movements, and spurred on by the recollection of the previous day's treachery, burst into the camp. Those of the Germans who were quick enough in seizing their weapons resisted for a time, fighting under cover of their wagons and baggage. But there were also a great crowd of women and children in the camp, for they had brought all their families with them when they left home and crossed the Rhine. These began to flee in all directions and were hunted down by the cavalry which Caesar sent out for the purpose. 15. Hearing cries behind them and seeing that their people were being massacred, the Germans threw down their arms, deserted their standards, and rushed out of the camp. When they reached the confluence of the Moselle and the Rhine, they realized that they could flee no farther. A large number were killed, and the rest plunged into the water and perished, overcome by the force of the current in their terror-stricken and exhausted state. The Romans returned to camp without a single fatal casualty, and with only a very few wounded, although a grim struggle had been anticipated against an enemy 430,000 strong. Caesar gave the prisoners detained in camp leave to depart, but as they were afraid of being killed or tortured by the Gauls whose lands they had ravaged, they said they wished to remain with him. They were allowed to retain their liberty,